Hello, everybody, and welcome to Unlearning Economics. As you might expect, you can't see anything. This is not working, but you should be able to see something in a second. Okay, cool. Well, that's not working. That's not working at all, is it?
Very exciting.
Yeah. This. Okay, one second. Let's just go display capture. Right. Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome to Unlearning Economics, typically seamless introduction. So I'm very happy today to have with me Duncan Weldon. Thank you so much for speaking to me, Duncan.
No worries.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me on.
So for the uninitiated, could you maybe introduce yourself a little bit?
Of course, I'll try my best. I'm Duncan Weldon. I'm a economist. Well, I worked as an economist for a long time, but more recently, I've worked in economic journalism. I'm currently back doing a stretch again at the Economist magazine covering Britain. But I've worked previously at BBC Newsnight. I've worked
Mm.
at Prospect magazine, and I've written a book which is an economic history of Britain called 200 Years of Muddling Through.
Yeah. 200 years of muddling through. Yeah, so that's the main thing we're going to talk about today. So I think one of the first things that would strike anyone who heard the title is, especially if they're not British, what
Yeah.
does that mean? Could you explain what
Yes.
200
Yes.
years of
So,
muddling
okay.
through is?
Of course. So, to step back for a second, it's an economic history of Britain since roughly the Industrial Revolution until about 2020 and the pandemic. It's called 200 Years of Muddling Through because I think sort of the default state of British economic policy has been to attempt to muddle through, to not really have a plan, to let things continue as they are. And, if things are going well, that's fine. And if things aren't going well, in a sort of very British way, to keep your fingers crossed and hope something will turn up eventually. So it's maybe a less technical way of saying, the UK is a liberal market economy rather than a, coordinated market economy, to use the old varieties of capitalism language.
Yeah, right. Okay. So it's. I mean, would you say it's a similar statement to saying that the British don't very often do massive radical reforms, and really what tends to happen is a sort of hodgepodge of ideas that and vested interests, that combine to
Yeah.
produce some kind of
Yeah.
change, but not that much.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. I mean, if you were to look back over the last, 80, 90 odd years of British government, you've got the Attlee government after the Second World War, which makes quite a radical change in the
Mm.
way the economy is ordered. You've got the Thatcher government in the 80s, which makes a sort of counter-revolution, but equally radically, big set of changes to sort of the institutions of the economy, to how the economy operates. But once you look beyond your Attlees and your Thatchers, you can maybe make the case for the Liberal government just before the First World War. You can maybe make a case for some governments in the middle of the 19th century, but you're looking at maybe four governments that have radically changed how the economy operates in the space of what, 250 years. I mean, it's not a great hit rate. The default state is
Mm.
not to be doing that. It's to be, yeah, hodgepodge, sort of half measures, hoping for the best.
Would you say this compares sort of differently to European economies? Then maybe would you say they're more prone to having these kinds of radical changes that we don't really do?
Yeah, I think they are. I think they are. Well, they're certainly, even if they're not having a radical change, there's more sort of a presumption that the way the economy is developing is something which the government is responsible for. That it's not just, British governments want growth and they want low unemployment and they want
Mm.
low inflation because that's what, motherhood and apple pie and whatever. These are good things that everyone wants. But they don't really question very often how they get it. They don't tend to mind what sort of growth they're getting as long as they're getting some sort of growth. Whereas you get when in journalism, when I speak to European finance ministers and European economics ministers, there's often much more concern with sort of the makeup of their economies, with how different types of firm are doing, and in particular, so we'll probably talk about later, with sort of the regional footprint of that growth and how it looks, which is something that British governments have historically cared less about.
Okay, that's interesting because it opens up one of the central themes of the book and something you introduced early on, right? Which is this idea of
Mm,
path
mm,
dependency. So essentially, what happens in the economy now can often be traced very far
yeah,
back. And you talk about regional inequality in
yeah,
that context, right? So, I mean, how does we obviously right now we have maybe a bigger gap between London and the rest of the country than
yeah.
ever before, or as big as it's been roughly. How does that relate to sort of things that happened, 100, 200 years ago?
Yeah, so I just step back. So, the reason I ended up writing the book was because I think path dependency really matters. I want to write a book about, originally I didn't think about writing an economic history of Britain. I thought about writing a book about Britain's economy in the 2010s, which is when I started working on it. And the more I thought about it, the more I decided that sort of the history of this matters, that one of my frustrations, often with economics, often with a lot of social sciences, it sort of starts almost too often from a blank page. But
Mm.
you're rarely starting from a blank page. What's happened before, the road you took to get somewhere has shaped and constrained the choices available to you now. And I think, particularly in a country like Britain, with a very long economic history, first country to industrialize, industrial revolution happens here, all of this sort of thing, that sort of long shadow of history really matters. And on the regional side, I think it does matter that England before Britain, but England before Britain was a very early state, and London was long its capital. So, there's this long history of London being this sort of dominant political city within England, and then within Britain and the United Kingdom, comes later. Sort of similar to Paris, but very different to some other European capitals, and
Mm.
very different history in the US. You've also had this very powerful city, and it was always a very rich city. The center of commerce as well as the center of politics. Now, one of my sort of favorite charts, because I think it's important to have a favorite chart if you've looked at 250 years of economic history, the chart the Office of National Statistics, Britain's National Stats Office, did to celebrate the census in 2011, so the census before last,
Yeah.
and just looks at England, where you've got census data back to 1801, and it looks at the share of the English population, sort of every 10 years, for 210 years, which is in the north of England. And it starts off fairly low. It rises quite sharply in the mid 19th century, into the 19th century as the Industrial Revolution happens. Sort of the center of that is Manchester in the northwest, and you see sort of more and more share of the English population living in the north. It goes from about 20% to about 35% over the course of about 40 years. Then it peaks in about the 1880s and has been in a long, slow decline ever since. That's just using population as a proxy, but it's not a bad proxy.
Mm.
That you've got sort of historically, you've had two periods in which the sort of gap between London and the rest, or London and the North, London and the Midlands, has narrowed. You had this 19th century story when early in the Industrial Revolution, the center of manufacturing is Manchester, the Great Port is Liverpool, Birmingham is a major industrial center in the Midlands, and you see this sort of rising GDP, rising population levels there. Um, but, that starts to peter out, before Queen Victoria's dead and is, back in decline. The only time you really in the 20th century see a narrowing in regional differentials is from the 1940s after the Second World War until the 1970s. When if we look at sort of GDP per head, growth is faster in the North and the Midlands than it is in London, the Southeast, much of that time. The differentials narrow, and then they've opened up again since the 1980s, and that's partially a sector story in that the bits of the British economy that have done best in the 80s, 90s, 2000s were finance, high value services. Bits that have done worst, manufacturing. You know, manufacturing is traditionally a larger share of output in the North and the Midlands and Scotland and Wales. Services stronger in London. So you've seen that gap open up. Really quite strongly. And, you're left in this position we've got now, where sort of the regional gaps within the United Kingdom are huge. Depending on how you measure it, larger than Italy's. At the very least, very comparable to Italy's. Its famous north-south divide, in many measures wider. Definitely wider than the gaps between what were until 3 decades ago East and West Germany. It's a phenomenal amount of regional inequality sort of baked into the UK.
So I suppose while all of that's true and this sort of path dependency and the long shadow of history, I think, is undeniable. I suppose some people who maybe want to be a bit more proactive about this might say to you, well, is this not just a political choice? Have we not just made overt mistakes, or, well, depending on your perspective, you might not call them mistakes, right? But is there not a way that we could just reduce this inequality with better political economy?
Well, you'd hope so, wouldn't you? You'd think. I mean, you'd think that it should be obvious that there are more. London is a very large city. The southeast is very large, but there are more MPs outside of London, the southeast, than there are within it. And yet, it's very easy to say that, but when something has persisted for generation after generation with governments of different political characters, you start to wonder how entrenched it is. Now, there are things you can do. I mean, the obvious one is, just the very, very obvious one is when it comes to infrastructure funding, and in particular, transport infrastructure funding, where we know
we're really good at that.
London. Oh yeah, London. Yeah, very, very good. Yeah, graded. But where the money is spent, it is disproportionately London and the southeast. And the Treasury has, it's sort of its formulas it uses. Calculates a benefit and cost ratio for infrastructure spending. There are two problems with this, the way it does it on public transport. Firstly, the models it uses prioritize investment where productivity is already high. Because they say, well, look, productivity is high there, therefore making this area better is going to get more bang for your buck, whatever. So you're sort of already building in a bias that if somewhere is already rich, it will benefit more from further infrastructure. And the Treasury's models are, they're not very dynamic on this. So they struggle to cope with the idea that some forms of infrastructure investment might be transformational. So you got all of that, and then even once you step beyond the methodology used in these models not being great and certainly being questionable, you can get, after a few years, they publish the lists of the benefit to cost ratios of various proposed investments. And it is noticeable that things with very low BCRs in London tend to get okayed, and things with marginally higher BCRs outside of London and the southeast tend not to. The example that people tend to bring up is the Docklands Light Rail, which runs from sort of the middle of London down to Canary Wharf, which the benefit to cost ratios on were just at or just below 1. And it was okayed. I once asked a Treasury civil servant about this while writing a piece on British infrastructure, and they said, the thing is, though, there's a lot of international bankers who really wanted the Docklands Light Railway, and they find it very easy to lobby the Chancellor in a way that people that wanted a tram in Leeds find quite difficult to.
Yeah. So there's already a bias baked into cost benefit analysis, right? Like you said, but then even if they didn't manage to correct that, they could at the very least listen to what they do and not bias it even further by basically they're not listening to the results. They're favouring the South even more in London in the results, which are already biased towards the South and London. Okay, yeah, that's a really good example. I want to go back a little bit more because I want to cover 200 years if we can. But I mean, so there are quite a lot of interesting tidbits and myth busting, I think, throughout the book. Which I think all good history books should have that kind of thing where you're like, oh yeah, though this actually wasn't true. This wasn't true. Just destroy everyone's favorite examples. So one thing that struck me is the Corn Laws.
Yeah.
So they're a rallying cry for free traders even today. I think people are, the protectionist measures enacted to favour farmers seemingly. They were a massive rallying cry for free traders of the era, David Ricardo, for instance, and people still reference them today. But what you say is there was a big there was a big debate about it. It was really big politically, but when they were abolished, it didn't actually have that much impact. It was kind of, it wasn't clear what the impact was.
Yeah, certainly not immediately. So, the Corn Laws, the Corn Laws put in place at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, 1815, and it's explicitly to prop up agricultural prices for British farmers and British landowners. And by the 1840s, the politics have changed in that what's happened between 1815 and the 1840s when they're repealed is Britain has completed its gone further in its industrial revolution. You've now land is much less important as a source of wealth than it was. You've now got this prosperous commercial and industrial middle class who are getting increasing political power. They're already getting more of them into Parliament before the 1830s had been dominated by a landed interest. You've now got this middle class sort of capital interest in Parliament. And, in the 1840s, they exercised their power. A lot of sort of the nascent working class who would obviously like cheaper food back them. You get the Corn Laws repealed. But yeah, the 1850s, the 1860s, you don't see a huge impact on this. It's really when you start to see an impact is the 1870s, the 1880s, and it's a technological change that the cost of shipping goods across the Atlantic really falls. You've got better railways in North America, and suddenly all of this sort of Midwestern grain can move by railways really quickly to East Coast US ports. It can move across the Atlantic quickly into Britain, and that's when you get what's sometimes called the American grain invasion. Food prices really start to move during this sort of age of globalization. Now, okay, you can make the counterfactual. Had the tariffs, the grain laws, the Corn Laws still been in place, maybe the impact wouldn't have been as dramatic. But it's certainly at the very least a very, very delayed reaction rather than an instantaneous one. And what's interesting about the Corn Laws is it's this fierce political fight, and it really is a fierce political fight. It pulls the Conservative Party apart. But once they're gone, they're gone. We've then got 70, 80 odd years of this complete free trade consensus in British politics, which is seriously challenged for a few generations.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how this free trade consensus has changed because, obviously before the Corn Laws, you had maybe the slightly more protectionist attitudes, and then you had the long period of free trade, which it has to be said coincided with the absolute dominance of the British Empire. And then it felt a bit like later on, when the British Empire wasn't doing so well, when the British economy wasn't doing so well in a relative sense, you started to get a revived interest in protectionism. And so I wonder, I mean, I see, you see this as well with some of Biden's policies, which are arguably protectionist. They're not tariffs so much as subsidies, right? But I just wonder, is free trade sometimes something, or often something, that countries just pursue when it's convenient for them, and then once it sort of stops being convenient, they suddenly rediscover that they need protectionism?
Well, look, it's certainly easier to be in favor of and I mean the thing about British free trade was unilateral free trade. No tariffs on anything coming in, regardless of what the other country's domestic setup was. But it's certainly easier for Britain to support. It was certainly easier for this to be the political consensus in Britain when Britain was the world's largest manufacturer, when it had a large empire, when it was when it was a net creditor country to much of the world. When yes, you'd get some people complaining about sort of American and German imports towards the end of the 19th century, but in the end, a lot of British people worked in export industries which were dependent on selling overseas. It was very, very easy. Once you're in a more insular world in the 1920s, after the First World War, this great age of globalization before 1914 is gone. It doesn't look like it's coming back for a long time. You've got increasingly high tariff walls in other countries. You've got high unemployment in Britain. Britain's now a debtor country. It's at that point, that the support, which had lasted for 80 odd years, falls apart. And I mean, not necessarily a direct link, but it certainly seems like quite a coincidence that 1913, no one is 1913. When the Conservatives have supported free trade and protectionist measures, they've taken a hammering in general elections. By the 1920s, when Britain is in a very different place in the world economy very quickly, this coalition fractures.
Yeah, and you have the rise of the Labour Party, right, over
Yeah,
that period. That was when they actually. When was their
yeah.
first government? It was in the 20s,
So
right?
not in mid-20s, yeah.
Yeah.
Although they were a very free trade party.
Oh.
This is the interesting, very, very free trade party. In the end, I mean, this is why I was Philip Snowden, who was Labour's first chancellor. Um, yeah, Chancellor in the 20s and Chancellor again in the Labour government. He's one of the ones that stays into the national government. Labour government falls apart. Ramsay MacDonald, the Labour Prime Minister, stays on as what's allegedly a national government, but is in reality a handful of Labour MPs and the Conservatives. Philip Snowden stays on as Chancellor. He oversees really, really very harsh austerity, stays. He doesn't resign from the government until it puts tariffs in place. So Philip Snowden, a man who's Labour's first chancellor, prepared to oversee really quite vicious austerity, draws the line at breaching free trade. It's a very weird place. Many of these early Labour MPs were in, where free. I mean, they were essentially Gladstonian liberals in many ways.
Mm.
They really supported this idea of free trade.
Yeah, it was. This was one of the things that kind of crystallized for me when I was reading your book, but I was vaguely aware of it. But the Labour Party has never really been like a Marxist Labour Party, has it?
Yeah.
It was more of a extension of the Liberal Party, and it was very much reformist. It wasn't
Yeah.
revolutionary from its inception.
Yeah, so like as it comes, it's an interesting one the way it comes together. So it's there's the trade union involvement, a lot of trade union involvement. The Fabian Society, who are a sort of socialist but reformist society, various sort of liberal types, and lots of them. They support free trade. They support more powerful working people, more less legal restrictions on trade unions. But it's not an explicitly socialist party. It's not clause 4, the famous clause 4 in favor of nationalizing
Mm.
industries, comes almost 20 years after the party has been established. So it's sort of a later, it's not there at the very, very beginning. And certainly, yeah, I mean, the first two Labour governments in the 20s and in the 30s, look in many ways like sort of pro-working class liberals, rather than certainly I wouldn't describe them as socialist.
And on the theme of muddling through, I think we were talking about radical change, right? And so it seems right to talk about the post World War II Labour government and the introduction of the NHS and the welfare state as we know it. I think while not to the point of contrarianism, but you do
Mm.
play down how much of a change this was, because I think for there are two things, right? One is what we've already said, which was that the
Yeah,
Labour government was never
yeah,
revolutionary, right? The second is that these things were building before the
yeah,
post World War II, and I
yeah.
think it's often sometimes I feel like our history of Britain for us in Britain, it kind of begins with World War II.
Yes.
Sometimes, right, and it's like actually no. There's a whole load of things happening before
Yeah,
then, and they
yeah.
came to fruition after World War II.
Yeah, so I think it's fair. So you've got the new so-called new liberal government for the First World War, and that's I think sort of the real sort of start of a sort of a nascent welfare state in Britain. Old age pensions in quite a limited way, unemployment insurance, all of the sort of quite small scale stuff, but it's happening. Um, and, the Beveridge report, which outlines sort of the model for the NHS and the British state. William Beveridge was a liberal um, himself, a member of the Liberal Party, and that's sort of the blueprint for it. What is different after 45, I think, is you obviously got nationalisation of various sectors, which is new, um, and you've just generally got and you've got a few things coming together. You've got this welfare state, which in Britain is designed on quite a liberal model, I think. You've got the nationalisation of various industries, but more than that, you've got this commitment to full employment and this sense that, look, the macroeconomy is something which is the government's job, to actively manage. And you've got this I think it's a fascinating debate in sort of the Labour Party in the 1940s. You see playing out in the first couple of years of that government between, um, so everyone is committed to a planned economy. If you're in the Labour Party in 1945, when you win the election, you're committed to a planned economy. But there is an active debate about what a planned economy means, and the two phrases that get used to describe the two sort of versions. One is there are some people for whom a command economy means sort of the kind of controls which have been put in place during the two total wars of the 20th century will continue into peacetime. There will be production quotas and there will be labor planning and all of this, and they become known as Gosplanners. After the Soviet Union's style of planning. And then you've got people for whom a planned economy doesn't mean that. What a planned economy means is essentially a Keynesian view of you will actively manage aggregate demand to keep employment high. And they become known as the thermostaters because they're the ones planning on using the budget to, if demand is too cool, turn up demand by government spending or cutting taxes. If the economy is overheating, turn it down. In the end, it's the thermostaters that win out over the Gosplanners in how that government goes about managing. And you see it as well. They continue to publish a national plan, but the first few years, sort of 45, 46, 47, I mean, it is much more sort of directional. Whereas by the end of that government, sort of 48, 49, 50, it is, it's Keynesian demand management rather than sort of active economic planning.
Yeah, I think yeah, it's interesting to contrast it. I mean, you could almost say maybe a bit glibly that one was about just macroeconomic big
Mm,
picture management, right? Whereas
mm.
obviously Gosplan would be like micromanagement as
Yeah,
well, right?
yeah,
It would be
yeah,
literally everything about every industry, the
yeah,
wage schedules, that what was
yeah,
produced, how much produced, blah
yeah,
blah blah. Everything would be managed from the top down.
yeah.
But I suppose one of the things that I mean, I got the sense that you weren't too enthused about the nationalized industries um, post World War II. But at the same time, I got the sense that you weren't that enthused about their privatization either in the
Yeah, no, no.
1980s.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, to step back for a second. It's one of these interesting things about Britain that, if you think about, one way to think about it is about sort of the economic borders of the state.
Right.
What is in the state sector, what is in the market sector, and it's not that unusual looking across much of Western Europe that sort of the economic footprint of the government, economic borders of the state, moved out in the 40s and 50s, and then moved in the 80s or 90s. It's a story to greater or lesser degrees you will find across most of Western Europe. Britain is unusual in the extent of the movements that you saw very large expansion of the economic footprint of the state in the 40s and a very large rolling back in the 1980s. And part of how British politics works, with first past the post elections and
Mm.
a government which is effectively an elective dictatorship. It's much harder for those big changes to happen um, in much of the rest of Europe. Now, I think the nationalizations in the 40s. I think what was interesting about them was, the model that was pursued was the model of a public corporation, very much designed on how the London County Council had ran its public transport in the 30s, which I guess was the blueprint you were looking at if you were, a Labour minister in 45. So, you nationalise the coal mines, you put them in, you have a new sort of British coal mining company, and it's now state owned, but management doesn't change a great deal. There's no real attempt at bringing sort of work any sort of real work and voice into how
Mm.
these organizations are run. Um, and I think the problem you had by the certainly by the late 60s, by the 70s. With lots of these things was, the Treasury did what the Treasury does. The Treasury regarded them as a source of revenue. It didn't like them being a cost, so you often saw quite underinvestment in them. And then in the 80s, they were privatized. And I think they were often privatized at very low prices. Um, and you get some great claims made that, you got this sort of surging productivity in these now privately owned enterprises. I think that's
Mm.
very, very hard to stand up in any. So you look at the utilities, for example. People talk about the utilities being more productive after privatization. I mean, they were more productive at the end of the 90s than they were at the at the end of the 80s, but that was also a decade in which productivity generally improved, and
Mm.
digitalization came in. British Gas at the time it was privatized was still relying on paper records. Um, I mean, it's quite a stretch to argue it wouldn't have switched to computer records regardless of who owned it, and that's quite a big part of the productivity
Mm.
improvement you saw.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's funny with the privatization thing as well, and you mentioned this, and I've seen it before, but you privatized these industries, but then the managers were the same. So it's like
Yeah,
while it's kind of seen as a big change, and
yeah,
if you've got the same people running them, yeah, okay, they face different
yeah,
incentives and everything, but
yeah.
like it's not that much of a departure from the past, right?
Yeah, I mean, the weirdest one I think was the some of the privatizations were relatively, things like British Steel or British Airways or British Telecom even by the end. You're taking a state-owned company where there is an existing market you can put it into.
Yeah.
Um, with the utilities, um, it was a much harder question. You're having to sort of invent a market for how these natural monopolies are going to um, compete or be regulated. One that didn't necessarily, well, in fact, no, not necessarily, just did not work well, I think
Mm.
is a clearer way of putting it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've got
Yeah,
the water. I think is
yeah,
the most recent example where
yeah.
I was just like, that has been such an astonishing failure, the
Mm,
privatization of water, and the
yeah,
trains don't exactly cover themselves in glory. I mean, I do want to say, and I say this, and it bothers some of my left wing followers, but the
mm,
failures of nationalisation were real. And you said there, right, there was no
yeah,
worker voice. I think,
yeah,
was it Nye Bevan who said something like, if a bedpan drops in Sunderland, we'll hear it in
yeah,
Whitehall. Just
yeah,
a very, despite not doing Gosplan, still quite a
yeah,
centralised, management centred ethos
yeah,
that, again, I think persisted through privatization, and just
yeah,
it speaks to this notion that we just don't really do radical change. Everything,
yeah, yeah.
even on the
I
surface,
mean,
if it's changing,
I
it's
mean,
not.
what's really interesting, I always think, is that what eventually sort of killed the attempt to go down a really much more managed economy road was the trade union movement.
Mm.
So, you get to the crunch point in 47, 48, and the more sort of dirgeist planners in government say, okay, Britain is in a hole here, a balance of payments hole. We need to reallocate more economic resources towards the export industries to earn more dollars overseas for various reasons, whatever. Um, so, one argument is we do it through tax incentives. Um, it's not going to be enough, so you're probably going to need some form of labor planning. Literally telling, and this is not as radical as it sounds in the context of the 1940s when, we've just had mass conscription very, very recently.
Mm.
It sounds very radical now, but the idea that you're going to say, okay, we need to move 200,000 workers into the following industries is not as radical as it sounds in the 2020s. The TUC will have none of it. The Trade Union Congress
Mm.
interferes with free collective bargaining, which is sort of the lifeblood of British trade unionism. And it's sort of the loss of trade union support, which says, okay, we can't have labour planning at the national level, and if you can't have labour planning, it's hard to have much sort of economic planning.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's another thing where it kind of crystallized for me reading the book, because I mean, it is true that if if you speak to people from, for example, Sunderland,
Yeah,
you will often find there's about as much hatred for someone like Arthur Scargill as there is for Margaret Thatcher, because the choices that the trade union movement of the time made. And you speak to this, right? It seems like they rejected a kind of middling plan to try
yeah,
and reduce their power, but which would nevertheless have sort of cemented their position as a part of Britain going
yeah.
forward. And then you ended up with, obviously, Thatcher, who wasn't good for the unions or Labour at all.
I just think if you're going to have a coal strike, you probably shouldn't go out in spring.
Well, yeah,
I mean,
that's
it's just
that is,
as a
yeah,
general.
yeah.
I'm from a coal mining town. He was an old national union mine workers friend. Did tell me at one point. I asked him what he thought of Arthur Scott when I was when I was 17, 18. When I asked him what he thought of Arthur Scargill, and it's all sort of stuck with me, his description of Arthur Scargill in the 1980s. He said Scargill went into that strike with a very large union and a very small house, and now there is a very small union and he has a very large house, which of course
Yeah. That's very good. I like that. um, yeah. So one more, just a bit more on post World War Two.
Yeah,
While I'm saying this period maybe wasn't as important as it's been painted, I'm also spending most of my time on it. But I think there are a lot of myths surrounding it, right? And
yeah,
one of them is, okay, so you've got this progressive move, you've got this macroeconomic management,
yeah,
full employment, you've nationalized the industry,
mhm,
you've got the welfare state for
yeah,
sure. Yet it was also quite an austere period, despite being perceived as progressive. We had rationing, there was low
yeah,
investment, and yeah, it seems like it's a little bit different to the way it was portrayed in, like, I don't know if you've seen The Spirit of 46,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Which
yeah.
I love, by the way, but like
That's it.
it wasn't just this great progressive moment. There was a lot of scarcity.
Yeah, I mean, so Britain, Britain has a series of very serious balance of payments problems,
Mm.
and it's all in the context as well that you're in a world in which after World War II, U.S. industry is massive and booming, and European industry is not. I mean, it's been completely twisted out of shape by the war, or bombed, or whatever. U.S. As consumer demand around the world, turns back on in the 40s, it's US industry that's capable of meeting it. There's general shortage of dollars. One thing that's certainly not very progressive about the Attlee government, which is often sort of ignored, is it's policy. So when we think about the Attlee government and the empire, we tend to think about things like Indian independence. We don't tend to think about things like, very quickly re-establishing colonial control
Mm.
in what's now Malaysia, was then Malaya. Why? Because rubber exports are a way of earning dollars. Very, very quick to take, outside of India to sort of, reassert imperial authority, because this stuff was often, the only way Britain thought it could earn dollars quickly, which it needed to pay for various imports from the US.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's really interesting the role of the Attlee government in imperialism.
Yeah,
There was also Iran, obviously, as well, was
yeah,
was a big one, and,
yeah,
what was
yeah,
at the time Standard Oil is now BP,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And I mean, I suppose that gives me an opportunity to ask more broadly, and a couple of people in my live chat, because we're live, have
yeah,
been asking about this. What do you think is the role of empire
yeah.
in British development? You have 30 seconds.
So I actually take I think it is not as important as sometimes portrayed, and I don't think it was a major benefit
Mm.
to the British economy. If you look throughout the 19th, okay, to start with, the empire was never a massive source of exports for Britain, except at times of extreme weakness. The empire was most important as a source of exports in the late 40s and the 50s, and in the 1920s. Throughout sort of the golden age of Britain being this sort of, world bestriding richest country in the world per capita, all of that, the single biggest, most British exports went to Europe, rather than to, imperial territories. So you can overplay the extent to which the empire um, was a major factor. That said, Britain, in 1913, I think the two go together. It's going to be more than 30 seconds. I'm going to give you my 30-second answer starting now.
Okay.
Now I thought of it. Okay. So I think, the key to understanding Britain is understanding that for whatever reason, and I think it was as much accident as anything else, the Industrial Revolution happens first in Britain. Britain is the first country to experience modern economic growth.
Mm.
And so you've just got this very weird period from the end of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th, when GDP per head in Britain is just hugely higher than almost any of its peers. Um, Britain is just this very, very, very wealthy country. That's never, ever going to last unless you think, there was something in the water in Britain, or something special about the people on this island, or whatever, that meant that,
Mm.
what we'd achieved would never be achieved elsewhere. So, this historical Britain turned this into, lots of this, used this power to build up a very, very large empire. And I think it's important to get the the ordering there,
Mm.
in that, the Industrial Revolution happens between the roughly the 1750s and the 1830s, give or take. You can debate that. The real rise of the British Empire to its greatest extent, all the scramble for Africa, all of that, is after that. So I don't think one necessarily causes the other. I think you can overplay the role of the empire in Britain's economic development. Um, you can also make the argument, which I think is an interesting one, that this sort of dominant global position ended up being not very good at all for Britain in the long run. If you look sort of the 1870s all the way to the First World War, Britain is this massive capital exporting country. Absolutely ginormous capital account surplus, money flowing out, to invest in, Indian
Mm.
railways and Argentinian railways and North American railways and factory projects and all of this. City of London just sort of funneling money around the world. And at the same time, this is when you start to see sort of the roots of British industry losing its world leading position, because if you're an investor in Britain in the 1890s, the early 1900s, and if you can get 6-7% returns on an investment overseas compared to only 3 or 4% domestically, you will invest overseas. So Britain funds a lot of the catch-up growth of countries that go on to become long-term rivals. Had Britain not been in this dominant global position, that almost certainly wouldn't have happened. The way I think about it is, just to understand quite how dominant Britain was in the global economy. If you go to sort of 1914-ish, just before the First World War, Britain is the largest exporter of manufactured goods in the world. It's the largest financial market in the world and the largest source of incoming foreign direct investment in the world. And it's also the second largest energy exporter in the world in the form of coal.
Yeah.
Just not trying to be glib about it. Britain in that age of globalization before the First World War is sort of playing the roles of the United States, Saudi Arabia, and China over the last 20 or 30 years, but all in one country. It's a phenomenally strong global position, which is then lost very, very, very quickly.
Yeah, I remember that Saudi Arabia, China, and the United States. Is that what you
Yeah,
said? Yeah, all at
yeah,
once. It's a memorable way of understanding Britain's role at that
yeah.
time. I
I
suppose
think
there's
Britain as a major energy exporter is something we tend not to think of in our our late 19th century to the early 20th. Britain is a massive energy exporter.
Mm, mm. There's this notion as well that empire was something that it was kind of a luxury that maybe enriched elites, but not necessarily, wasn't necessarily that great for the whole country, right? Would
Yeah,
you
I think
agree with that?
I completely would agree with that. I mean,
Yeah.
the people investing in Indian railways were not, manufacturing
Mm,
workers in Birmingham or Manchester or Sunderland.
yeah.
Yeah, no doubt about that at all.
And by the way, all of this, I just want to make it clear to everyone. I don't think the conclusion here is that empire is good.
Oh
It's
no,
it's
no,
that it wasn't necessarily crucial in British economic development, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um, yeah. Okay. So one thing. So I I want to ask you about a tweet that you did in 2016, which you probably don't remember. But it's funny. It really impacted me, and I remembered it when I was preparing for this
yeah,
interview. So you once tweeted, and this relates to maybe your view of empire and
yeah.
muddling through and everything. You once tweeted one of your rules for studying history was never to go full Marx and never to go full Macaulay. So could you do you remember tweeting that? And if so, could you explain
I
it?
don't remember the exact phrase, but okay, so full marks, I would say, okay, full marks, your audience is probably more familiar with, but full marks is to be, yeah, meant slightly light-heartedly, obviously, but it's to assume you can take a very sort of deterministic read of history based on material forces, which will move, in a fairly predictable way. The one that the one we'll talk about Engels and Engels' pause, I'm sure, in a moment. I think it's
Yeah.
very interesting, the timing and all of that. Yeah, and I think, like if you read the book, there is a lot of small m um, Marxist analysis scattered throughout. My fundamental understanding of the development of Britain in the 19th century is the interplay of the decline of the landed interest versus the rise of a commercial middle class or bourgeoisie or whatever you want to call them, followed by the new industrial working class. There's a lot of use in this. Macaulay, sort of the classic Whig historian of Britain, Macaulay's History of England, this Whiggish view is that, the history of the world and the history of Britain and the history of England in particular, and Macaulay preferred the term England, is this sort of story of, everlasting, this eternal march of progress towards, this sort of liberal ideal which Britain he thought had arrived in, the 1830s. And, no doubt would have been even happier over the following few decades. But I think, never, never, never assume there is this iron law of progress towards where you are now. Never assume that the future is completely knowable, and most importantly, try not to always view history with this sort of backwards rear view mirror from the point you are now, and assume that the point you are now is inevitable because that's where you were. I mean, in the end, chance and contingency play a huge role throughout this. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's like sorry.
16.
What did you say? Sorry,
that's the most I've ever spoken about a tweet I did 7 years
ago. Yeah. It was a bit of a rogue question, but I think it does get to the heart of your approach. But yeah, I mean, it's like the trade unions, right? It's like Arthur Scargill. Maybe if it had literally been a different individual, you might have seen a completely different development, and it's kind of hard to accept that. I think it really bothers me personally.
Yeah, I know. Great. I've saw, the Engels Paul stuff is fascinating. So Engels moves to Manchester, and writes Condition of the Working Class in Manchester. And so it's this weird thing that, I mean, what I love about it is, the reason Engels is in Manchester is that his well-to-do parents, think he's becoming quite radical and are quite worried about him. So they send him to look after the family's interests in Manchester. It's like, if you want to radicalize someone, send them to the beating heart of industrial capitalism in the mid-19th century.
Yeah, one of the most miserable periods of industrial capitalism.
Yes. So, and he writes The Condition of the English Working Class, which is, it is genuinely a fascinating read and packed full of numbers and stats. And, you see a lot of it in sort of the analysis underpinning a lot of what Marx is writing at the time. But what's happened is, in as much as economic numbers are ever certain, the best estimate is that, from the sort of 1780s, 1790s until the 1840s, you get this huge increase in productivity in Britain, and almost no movement at all in real wages. So you've had this 50 or 60 year period in which, productivity has risen, wages have been flat or possibly slightly down in real terms, huge immiseration of people, falling life expectancy, in early industrial cities, a sort of mortality sinks. People move to them and they die because they're so unsanitary. And, you can see exactly why, Marx and Engels write that, this system is completely doomed because all that's happening is, economic growth is increasing, but it's all going into the form of profits. But then, it changes in between the 1850s and about 1910. Suddenly, you see this huge growth in real wages in Britain, and so this weird thing that just at the time that the problem is diagnosed, the problem starts to temporarily, at least, reverse itself, and then you get 5 or 6 decades of actually, very, very steady real wage growth.
You can see why somebody would look at that period and say, surplus value is being extracted from the workers. Yeah. Workers are only paid the amount that it takes for them to survive, and basically capitalism is doomed. Because it really did
this has been happening for 50 or 60 years at that point.
Yeah.
It's fair. It's completely understandable to look at something that's been happening for 50 or 60 years and assume it's going to continue. So I think when I was saying don't go full Marx, what I was trying to say was don't assume the trend will continue forever.
And another thing that's related to this, right, which I wanted to ask you about is because one of the things I quite liked about this book is that as I was reading it, I would have thoughts occur to me, and then you'd mention the same thing on the next page. So at one point you say, when you were detailing what happened with the Thatcher government and the various interests, the people who voted for it, the people that Thatcher favoured, I was thinking, God, this is a bit of a challenge for like a pure class-based theory of
Mm.
politics, right? And then you
Yeah,
literally said, false consciousness, I don't think can explain this
yeah,
because people had an obvious material interest in
yeah,
voting conservative, right? It's not just false
yeah.
consciousness. So, I mean, do you think that Marxist class analysis just isn't great at explaining politics? I don't know. Maybe it was at one point. Maybe it wasn't in the 80s.
I
Maybe it hasn't
think
been for ages. I don't know.
I do think. Look, I think British politics from say the 1920s to the 1970s um, is easier to understand in a sort of pure class basis,
Mm,
particularly when you've got, essentially one party of capital, one party of labor, and Britain is, a country where, you've still got mass industries. It all sort of makes sense. I think it starts to become much harder. Um, sort of the peak of industrialization, the peak, when was Britain peak industrial? At some point in the mid 60s, about 30 or 35%, I'll get this wrong, of the about 30% of the workforce worked in industry.
mm,
Uh, and often in very large workplaces. By the sort of 70s, you've got this large working class. You've got very strong trade union movement, about
mm,
50% coverage at that point. You can see why it makes sense to sort of, use this basic class frame as a way to think about politics. I think once you start seeing deindustrialization, once you start seeing more people working for smaller and medium-sized businesses, once you see more and more people working in the service sector, often in smaller workplaces, once you see home ownership really start to take off in the 70s and more people feeling like they own capital, everything becomes more confusing and
mm,
harder. But why I think, you talk about material interest, I mean, in the 1980s, there were an awful lot of working class British people who repeatedly voted Conservative
mm.
because they were doing very well out of it. Whether they bought a council house or whatever it happened to be, or seeing their own taxes go down. I think the lesson of the 1930s and the 1980s, and actually I'd add the 2010s to that as well. There's 3 decades which, by any objective stretch, were tough times for the British economy and for a lot. In the 1930s we had very high unemployment in some areas. In the 1980s, we had very high unemployment in some areas.
Mm.
In the 2010s, we had, essentially zero real wage growth. Um, the interesting thing about Britain's political system is, governments can consistently get re-elected throughout a decade, which many people looking back would say, well, that wasn't great economically, as long as the pain is concentrated in enough areas,
Mm.
in few enough areas, and there are a wide enough coalition of people who are winning out of it. I think what we saw in the 2010s, the 1980s, and the 1930s was a government presiding over what, to many economists looks like a poor performance or a slump or whatever you want to call it, but they're creating enough winners.
Yeah, yeah, it's a depressing but likely true
Yeah,
thought.
yeah.
Before I let you go, I want to finish kind of where we started because I saw something. Martin Wolf referenced your book in the Financial Times recently,
Very, very
right?
nice of him. It
Yeah,
was,
yeah. He praised the book, right? But and this relates to exactly what you were just saying.
yeah,
But he said muddling through is no longer enough.
yeah,
So I suppose, what do you think about recent years? Because I think the book does cover recent years, but it sort of it spends perhaps, well, probably the same amount of time on them as it does every other period, which is to say comparatively less compared to a
yeah,
lot of books. And I'm just wondering
yeah.
what you think. I mean, are we muddling through now, or are we just sort of mucking up?
Yeah, well, I think we're muddling through and mucking up at the same time. I mean, because you step back. Okay, I think if you look at the 2020s in Britain, um, it is going to be a difficult decade. And what I've learned is it's much easier writing about the past than talking about the future. But let's talk about the future because it's
Mm,
the end. Um, you're going to have you got Brexit. But whatever you think, rights or wrongs, it's a change in Britain's economic model. It's a challenge to many firms' business model. That's going to be something that's going to be dealt with one way or another. You've got to find a new economic model. You've got net zero, and that you look at any of the projections for how we get to net zero by 2050, or it's climate change committee, whoever. Um, it involves a lot of active decision making and a lot of expenditure in the 2020s and the early 2030s if you're going to hit those targets. You've then got the aftermath of the pandemic
Mm.
on top of that. And nowadays, one big lasting impact is a big rise in working from home. He says, looking around his home he's working from today. Um, and you've got demographic change at the same time. So if you've got a decade in which you've got quite important, quite large demographic change,
Mm.
aftermath of the pandemic, decisions to make about net zero, and fallout from Brexit still unresolved, Britain needing a new economic model, it's not a decision, it's not a decade you want to attempt to muddle through. It's one of those decades when you need some form of active choices, and they're not being made. The column Martin's column this week, referring to that report on sort of stagnation nation
Mm.
by the Resolution Foundation on Britain, which is a very good one. But just sort of starkly setting out the numbers about Britain's relative economic decline over the last decade and a half, how it's not inevitable that will reverse, and if it is going to be reversed, it's going to require an economic strategy, which is
Yeah.
something British governments, as I've said, struggle to put in place.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like with High Speed 2, for instance.
Yeah,
I realized over High Speed 2, not just that it went wrong, but it was it was a broader symptom of the fact that we don't have a transport strategy.
yeah,
And the truth is, we don't have an anything strategy, really, do
yeah,
we? We don't like good planning or investment at all. And it
yeah,
just seems like something that probably needs to change if we're to get on a bit better than we
yeah.
have been.
Completely. And the things we've speculated about towards the end of the book, which I think is changing now, and I think inflation has changed it. But, I think what has been really interesting, if you think of the story of Britain's political economy over 200 years, for many, many years, it's just dominated by landed interest, many of whom were aristocrats, control House of Lords, but the economic structure of Britain is about agriculture and land, and you can understand why that political structure is in place. And then you
Mm,
get the rise of sort of, you get the Industrial Revolution, you get the rise of sort of commercial and industrial capital.
sure.
They fight for and win political rights and representation in Parliament. They change the way Britain works, in
Mm,
terms of embracing free trade and all of that. 20th century, you see the industrial working class gaining more political power, gaining the vote. You get the welfare state, but you can look at the interplay of these different economic interest groups and understand how Britain has been pushed in one path or another. I think what's been really interesting in the last 10, 15 years is the rise of what I call, for want of a better term, a sort of almost post-economic vested interest, by which I mean older people who are either near or at retirement, who are likely homeowners,
mm,
who often have quite secure defined benefit pensions of a kind which not many, are very, very few indeed are still open nowadays, for whom generally, if you own your own house and you have a secure inflation-linked income, then you are to a large extent sort of insulated from the day-to-day gyrations of the economy, and you can care about other things. And I
mm,
think this was a core part of the coalition which re-elected the government over the last few years. Now I suspect the experience of the cost of living crisis over the last 2 years, and 10%, no one is immune from 10% inflation. I suspect that's undermined that, but I think that's a big challenge. It's a hard one. If you're used to thinking about political economy in terms of what do these people want out of the economy, not in terms of, well, what happens in the economy doesn't really affect these people, so they can care about other things.
mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's really interesting, that post-economic thing. It reminds me of Keynes when he said people will be free to pursue other things than economics, and economic
Yes.
possibilities for our
Yeah.
grandchildren. But he literally just meant the boomers, I suppose. That's it.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so I know you have to go and pick up your children, so I won't keep you any longer. But thank you so much, Duncan. It's been really interesting, and it's a really great book. Yeah, 200 years of muddling through. So I recommend anyone who's interested to check it out.
Thank you so much. Lovely to
Thanks,
speak.
Duncan. See you.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Hey, what am I doing? I'm here. I'm here. It's not working. It's just like at the beginning when it wasn't working either. Anyway, seeing as this isn't working, I guess I'll just say goodbye. But thanks for joining, everybody. Yeah, it was a rapid one. I was hoping to get Duncan for 2 hours, but I realised he had to pick up his children, so it was only 1 hour long. But I could have, yeah, I had a lot more questions, but I don't know, maybe another time. Thanks for joining, everyone. See you.